This is part 2 of my history of the AC car company. Part 1 covered the years 1899 to 1961. One day in 1961, an American gent rolled up in a taxi at the Thames Ditton High Street Works. It was Carroll Shelby following up on his proposal to create a V8-engined Ace. Initially a Ford engine of 221 cubic inches, or 3.6 litres, and I think AC had planned to call the car the Ace 3.6. But then the 260 or 4.2 litre engine became available, while Shelby dreamt up the model name Cobra. It was nothing new to put a big V8 into a British sports car. AC had fitted one or two Chevrolet V8s into Aces for customers. It's also well known that Allard fitted side valve Ford V8s into their cars. However, the new Ford engine with its short stroke was small externally and only a little heavier than the Bristol 6. I won't be giving the full Cobra story, as it's so well known, but I will concentrate on the British side, especially since there is a certain amount of misinformation about this. For example, Cobra histories sometimes show AC's production of invalid carriages as a sign of desperate times. As I already reported in part 1, that contract was an old ongoing deal. Also, the chassis prefix of CSX shows AC still using an X to denote left-hand drive. There are a small number of early right-hand drive Cobras with the chassis prefix CS, such as CS2030, as seen here sporting an AC badge on the front. Alan Turner was also the unsung hero of the design and development. He died in the same year as Shelby, in 2012, but Turner's passing went largely unreported. Getting back to 1961, Turner was put under pressure to develop the first Cobra fast. A Salisbury final drive to take the extra power, stronger axle stubs, suspension, etc. The chassis was beefed up accordingly. Cobra critics pointed out how outdated the chassis and suspension were at this time, and they were not wrong. Ever since independent suspension became commonplace, chassis design went through an intensive period of development. But there was no time for a redesign. Shelby was a man in a hurry, and the production numbers envisaged would stretch to AC's modest facilities. There was also the difficulty in communicating between engineers in the two countries. There was an amusing moment at the AC works when the first V8 engine arrived. Someone there claimed that a crate with Japanese writing had arrived. The writing said Fomoko. Turner had to concentrate mainly on the back end of the car design, as it was rushed into production. More work on improvements had to be phased in. The first 75 Cobras had the 260 engine, before upgrading to the 289 for the Mark II Cobra. A short time afterwards, the Cobra finally got the rack and pinion steering. All production of other AC models was terminated, but Marczewski continued with his own design work, since the Cobra was not likely to be part of AC's future. In fact, the Cobra was not part of AC's British sales at first, leaving loyal AC enthusiasts frustrated. The prototype AC that Marczewski built is known as MA200, referring to its chassis number. This impressive car looks surprisingly like the AC Frewer convertible that appeared later, but Marczewski was responsible for this design. It even had the same wheelbase as the later AC. Marczewski had also drawn up an alternative design for a mid-engine sports car with his flat engine, but this was not built. MA200 used to be referred to as the Flat 6 prototype, until one of its later owners pointed out that a Flat 6 would never fit the chassis design. This car had a Ford 289 V8 when it was first registered. Marczewski, when interviewed in his retirement, claimed the Flat 6 went in, the car was tested on the road, but then he was ordered to fit the V8. He then cut off the front end of the chassis and built a new front end to take the Ford engine, which he sarcastically called a lorry engine, as it was not as light as his engine. Derek Hurlock disagreed with that version of events and claims that the Flat 6 was never installed. Whatever really happened, the reason for the new engine being abandoned is the most common explanation for most things that happened: money. For 1/8 of the cost of building the lovely Flat 6, you could buy the mass-produced Ford engine. The rest of the car's design is quite interesting. The chassis is a square tube space frame. Suspension is all independent with inboard front springs operated via cantilever upper arms. Needle roller bearings were an unusual feature of the suspension pivots. It's so sad that this did not go in production, but MA200 still survives. I've just found an article by one of the owners of MA200 published in the Club magazine in March 1986. He confirms that the chassis could not even be altered to take the flat 6 and then the V8. He also highlights the factory drawings that are labelled V8. He gives more details of this interesting design. The only things in common with Cobras are the engine, clutch, the pedals, steering wheel, handbrake lever, and some of the instruments. It started out with a Cobra gearbox, but the slippery body styling allowed it to exceed the engine's rev limit, so they installed a 5-speed ZF box giving 30 miles per hour per 1000 RPM in 5th gear. That good streamlining also made 25 miles per gallon easy to attain. That's about 21 in American gallons. Much of the car was unique, including the windscreen. The rear brakes were inboard discs and an experimental design by Girling, with 2 small pots on one side of each disc and 1 larger pot on the other side. Handling was good, but with no handbook this owner had to do some trial and error for tracking and tyre pressures. Body panelling is 22 gauge aluminium, which is very thin, about 0.7 of a millimetre I think. Returning to the Cobras, AC's loyal customers finally got their hands on this car when it was launched for the home market. Chassis numbers had the prefix COB for right-hand drive and COX for left-hand drive. With huge successes racing in the USA, thoughts turned to international endurance races such as the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Some enthusiasts were sceptical that an outdated design could be competitive, but the production GT class seemed achievable. For the 1963 Le Mans, AC provided a pair of right-hand drive Cobras, with one used for development and the other one entered in the race. As there was also a private entry from the USA, AC ran the cars as a team. The Sunday Times newspaper sponsored the team, and Sterling Moss was the team manager. This venture was the idea of an AC Owners Club member who was then tasked with much of the organising. The pit team was largely made up of club members, AC employees and journalists all pitching in to help. In the race, the privately entered Cobra suffered a major engine failure, but it was up in 4th place overall at the time. The AC entered Cobra came in 7th overall, behind 6 Ferraris, but 1st in class and 1st British car. The following winter, both Shelby and AC decided to take advantage of the rules that permitted a change of body style. While Peter Brock was working on the Daytona Coupe for Shelby, Alan Turner got to work on his own racing coupe. It has the special chassis number A98. Turner stiffened the chassis and created a beautiful coupe shape, lower and longer than the Daytona. It was completed just in time for testing at Le Mans. Sadly, William Hurlock passed away early in 1964. This car is most famous for its test run on the M1 motorway very early one Sunday morning in June 1964. Drivers Peter Bolton and Jack Sears tested the car stability, as well as testing 2 brands of tyres. At that time there was no speed limit on the M1, and high-speed test runs were relatively commonplace. These tests were run over a short distance of about 3 miles between 4 and 5 AM when the road was empty. Speed attained was calculated to be about 185 miles per hour, going from the rev counter. The club editors took some photos and submitted them to the newspapers. That's when the storm started. Despite all the outrage, the motoring folklore about the 70 mile per hour speed limit is false. This incident had little or no effect on the eventual government decision. It was a masterpiece of publicity just in time for the race. The AC was very thoroughly prepared, and the club editor observed that only minor adjustments were needed after final practice. He contrasted that with the frenetic activity around the Daytona Cobras. In the race, A98 proved to be equally fast as the Daytonas. Early in the race, A98 was in 4th place overall. Cobras were mixing with the prototype cars near the front. A98 suffered a setback with fuel blockages, which turned out to be paper that had been shoved into the fuel tank. Sadly, during the night, A98 crashed badly. The editor and mechanics rushed over to investigate. French officials said the AC had hit several trees and rolled 3 times. Peter Bolton walked away largely unhurt from the wreckage. The cause was a rear tyre wearing thin and bursting. Apparently they were wearing thin on the Daytonas too. For some reason the French authorities took away the AC's final drive after claiming it had seized. That false story still persists in Cobra histories. Sadly, a Ferrari that swerved to avoid the crashing AC hit and killed some young spectators who were in a restricted area. That tragedy affected Derek Hurlop badly, who no longer took an interest in racing Cobras. Plans to produce a limited number of A98 replicas were abandoned. One of the Daytonas survived the race to take the GT trophy, coming fourth overall. A98 was later rebuilt by an enthusiast, using the original body buck, the original craftsman to make the panels, and many of AC's spares. It was back on the road again by 1985. Most of the other Cobra racing stories are well known, so I'll skip to the Mark III Cobra. Some Cobra histories claim that the Mark III title only came into use later, retrospectively. AC Heritage have archived paperwork from AC cars proving that they were known as Mark IIIs from new. In fact, you can see it here in this June 1965 Club Bulletin. The Mark III was designed to take the 7-litre 427 engine. The Daytona Cobras had narrowly missed taking the 1964 World GT Championship, so Shelby wanted something even faster. To take the extra weight and power, AC created a stronger chassis with tubes increased from 3 to 4 inches. That might not seem like rocket science, but it would almost double the torsional stiffness of the overall chassis, offset slightly by the increased width. Suspension finally got the update it needed and became conventional double wishbones with helical springs. Much is made in history about how one of Ford's industrial computers was used to calculate suspension geometry. My own view is that Turner could probably have done it fine with his own slide rule. The new Cobra was wider as well, as were the tyres. Although the chassis might seem archaic compared to the superb products Lola and Lotus, the Cobra chassis was not as bad as some might suggest. As with the earliest Cobras, Shelby was in a hurry, and there was a rush in the AC works to try and get 100 of the Mark IIIs built. The rule for GT racing was that 100 cars must be sold if it is to qualify as a production GT. There is still confusion about who built these cars because Shelby removed AC badges and even fitted Shelby American builders plates on the cars. AC was sneaky though. The clutch and brake pedals still had big AC badges on them. Photographs also show the very early production, with cars featuring the competition spec lifting brackets. Needless to say, AC's official books record every car they built. In the event, only just over half the intended batch was built, presumably due to lack of time. Also, Ferrari pulled their works team out of the 1965 GT Championship, making the Shelby Daytona Challenge a bit easier. AC then produced a road-going version of the 427 Mark III, with rear tailpipes and chrome bumpers. I think they were all left-hand drive from new, but a small number have been converted. Engines were installed in the USA by Shelby, although at least one was completed by AC and sold in the UK. AC still had to look ahead to keep sales going. In 1965 they launched a version of the Mark III for the home market, fitted with a 289 engine and usually with wire wheels. It did not sell well, with fewer than 30 produced, as there was not much demand over here. More promising was AC's plans for a new luxury car. They lengthened the Mark III Cobra chassis by 6 inches and entered the market for big Grand Tourers. These were all the rage in the 1960s in Europe. In Italy there was the Iso Grifo, in France the Facel Vega, and in the UK was the short-lived Gordon Keeble and later the Jensen Interceptor, following from the CV8. Some of those were very heavy cars, whereas AC's offering was somewhat lighter and faster. It weighed 2,800 weight, or a little over 1,400 kilograms. With Italian style and coach building so popular at this time, AC went to Frua in Turin to use a design they had already drawn up. They displayed the prototype AC 428 at the 1965 Motor Show. It was a convertible with a mostly steel body. Production versions were all of steel, with the bodies built by Frua and welded onto the chassis that AC built. The engine was the Ford Galaxy 7-litre engine, which had a longer stroke than the Cobra engine. Most of these 428s had 3-speed automatic gearbox, although a few had a 4-speed manual. There was also a fastback version, and a couple of early cars had 427 engines fitted. AC had planned to have the first ones bodied by Frewer and then switched to a UK bodybuilder. This was a cost-effective way to get back into luxury car building. Unfortunately, AC had major problems with Frewer. Build quality was not up to AC's exacting standards, and they had to do further work on cars when they returned to Thames Ditton. When AC investigated what was happening in Turin, they were not amused to find chassis lying outside and took photos of the poor conditions. Even worse, there were strikes in Italy, including at Frewer. AC had eager customers lining up, but not enough cars. They almost got a deal with the Coventry panel maker to take over, but it fell through. It seems such a pity that Marczewski's MA200 project did not become the new car. Meanwhile, the road testers had some fun with the AC 428. A standing quarter mile in just over 14 seconds in the 3-speed auto version, and a top speed of 145 miles per hour, or 150 miles per hour for the manual AC. 0 to 100 in about 14 seconds. Fuel consumption in British Imperial gallons was 14 to 18 mpg. With its longer wheelbase, it was easier to handle the power and torque than the Cobra. Maximum power was a modest 345 bhp, but extremely flexible for real-world long-distance driving. There was plenty of scope for uprating. AC were maintaining their reputation for being friendly and helpful to existing customers. Keen owners were like part of an AC family. AC was still trying to plan ahead and were thinking about another 4-seater car to satisfy customer demand. Frewer had a recently abandoned project for a big saloon with a unitary body construction. They completed the body for AC, whose engineers then got to work on it. They weren't keen on the rear de Dion axle and made their own independent system to fit around the rear seat accommodation. They also changed the steering system and fitted front suspension similar to the 428s. I've seen this car referred to as the 7-litre saloon and also the AC 429. Motor panels of Coventry helped AC out, and it was hoped they might be able to build the bodies, but the costs were very high. Ford were warning that V8 production might end fairly soon, and they also ceased supplying engines directly to AC. Type approval was also looming, and making things more difficult for tiny manufacturers to survive. The market for sports cars was changing too, as the old school definition of sports included a complete lack of any luxury for the hardcore enthusiasts. Now buyers wanted a more refined car. Women were becoming a more significant part of the car buying market too. AC needed to change. Then in 1973 the oil crisis hit, and it looked like it was the end for big engine cars, at least in the UK. As luck would have it, opportunity came knocking at AC's door shortly before this latest crisis. In late 1971, Derek Hurlock was approached by the designers of a mid-engine sports car that was only at the scale model stage. At that time, AC were not interested. At the 1972 motor show, AC were approached again, armed with some photos. Derek Hurlock took a look and said, "It's amazing what you can do with models." They replied, "Models? It's parked outside." They had built a prototype. Experienced racing engineers Peter Bahana and Robin Stables, formerly of Lola Racing Cars, had created a closed sports car with a transverse mid-engine. It was called the Diablo. It had a space-frame chassis of rectangular tubing. The engine installed was a 1750 unit from a scrapped Austin Maxi, noting that there were not many transverse engine gearbox combinations available in those days. Despite the modest power plant, it was capable of 120 miles an hour. The designers were not aiming for a very high top speed anyway, and had prioritised road holding and handling, and everything else for a great road car. In the decade of wedge-shaped styling, the Diablo looked quite individual, but was also practical, as all-round visibility was good, and the small overall size made it easy to manoeuvre. This prototype had proved its potential already. Also, the shrouded rear window tended to remain dry in adverse weather. Bahana and Stables were taken on by AC as consultants to assist in redesigning the car into a viable production vehicle. Vin Davison of AC Ace fame was involved, as was Alan Turner. The main redesign was the chassis, largely due to Vin Davison's excellent work. The AC 3000 ME, as it became known, featured a central chassis tub with very deep sides and incorporating the bulkheads. Front and rear subframes were bolted on, partly to aid maintenance and assembly, and partly for crash crumple zones. The petrol tank was mounted at the centre of gravity so that fuel load will have less effect on handling. The tank was also installed under an inverted chamber within the chassis so that if the car rolled over, fuel spillage would be caught, as well as keeping it separate from the engine bay for fire safety. Doors feature side impact beams to complement the protection afforded by the deep sills. The chassis features a very strong rollover bar. With so many safety features, Lloyd's underwriters were consulted in the hope that insurance premiums could be kept low. For the suspension, a new and special SKF bearing unit was employed, and this allowed AC to make light alloy hub carriers to reduce unsprung mass. Brakes were developed with Girlings, taking advantage of the rear weight brace, which favours good stopping performance. The body shell was fiberglass, double-skinned, with AC keen for higher quality panelling than other GRP cars. The big issue was the drivetrain. BMC said they couldn't spare their Austin Maxi engines. AC were keen to stay with Ford, and it was the British-made Ford SX V6 3-litre that was chosen. This presented a challenge for the transmission, since the engine installation was transverse. AC designed a gearbox using Hewland-made internals. The engine drove it via a triplex chain. With so much development and a very forward-looking and advanced little sports car, it is easy to wonder if this project could bankrupt such a small firm. This was the decade when not-so-small car firms collapsed, including Citroën and British Leyland. Derek Hurlock was nervous about going ahead with the 3000 ME. The design was displayed at the 1973 Motor Show, and the press and public loved it, so AC pressed ahead with the development. Then the dreaded type approval hit AC. A quick look at government archives shows endless paperwork that reads like a famous Groucho and Chico Marx routine. But the nightmare of understanding the legalities was at least of AC's worries. The Ministry of Transport charged so-called administration fees for each item on the car that was ticked off on the list. These extortionate fees prompted Derek Hurlock to complain to the relevant minister, who, to his credit, got the fees reduced for AC. It is worth noting that about 20 years later, small specialist car makers became exempt from crash testing their products, just as long as they could convince a government inspector that the design was likely to give sufficient protection. And speaking of crash testing, that became probably the biggest headache for AC. It is ironic that a new design loaded with crash safety features that were not officially tested failed its first crash test. The test was 30 miles per hour into concrete block, and the steering wheel moved a fraction of an inch too far. This led to long delays in redesign and more funds going into the project. The oil crisis did not help sports car makers, and the economic and industrial situation in the UK was not good in general. AC 428 production had been abandoned in the light of the high fuel prices, leaving AC with no car sales. I think the Invalid car contract had ended by this time too. As things got delayed, this caused a chain reaction as dealers lost interest and the initial excitement among potential customers faded. It was 1979 by the time the 3000ME got properly into production, after a great many prototypes and crash test cars had been built. Fortunately, the design was so advanced that it still looked very up to date. Other rival wedge-shaped sports cars were also using fairly modest-sized engines. Oil prices were still high. So, what else could go wrong? A road test around 1980 hinted at handling shortcomings when driven at the limit. Derek Hurlock tested the car more and couldn't find any issues. Later classic car road testers said they have no idea what the complaint was about. There must have been something, at least when racing, since a subtle improvement to the rear suspension was offered by a racing specialist. That was Robin Rue, an engineer and racing driver who offered various upgrades to the 3000ME, including turbocharging the Essex engine. In simplistic terms, the performance of the standard car was 0 to 60 in 8.5 and 120 miles per hour top speed. While that's not blisteringly fast, this car was about high average speeds on the road, and of course having fun. With so much cash sunk into the project, AC Cars Limited became AC Cars plc, a public limited company. Sadly, this superb car design failed to sell in the numbers hoped for, ultimately selling about 70 by 1984. With no dealers, the factory was selling directly. Many customers really loved the cars, which were popular with lady owners too, and many of them joined the AC Owners Club. AC sold the High Street factory and moved into smaller premises in Summer Road. By the 1970s, it was more evident that the car world had become a much bigger challenge for small specialists, partly because of the ever-increasing legislation across the world. At this point, I need to mention another company whose history was to combine with ACs in the 1980s. In the early 1970s, Brian Anglis set up a business called Cobra Parts, supplying, not surprisingly, parts for Cobras here in the UK. Mechanical parts were not as readily available over here, away from the Cobra's main market. This business became known as CP Autocraft, and then simply Autocraft. They had acquired the original tooling from AC to build new bodies and chassis, so that they could rebuild badly damaged Cobras. By the early 1980s, they reached an agreement with AC to use the AC trademark and license on brand new Cobras. These cars were known as the AC Mark IV. They were developments of the Mark III Cobra with slightly improved chassis design and small changes to comply with modern regulations. The engine used was the 5-litre Ford V8 from the Mustang. This was launched in time for a huge boom in classic car values, making these continuation ACs very profitable. I felt bad for AC, having gone through the whirlwind brief period of Cobra production, made little money only to miss out on the huge nostalgia market. The AC Mark IV later became the AC Cobra Mark IV, as permission to use the Cobra brand was granted by Ford, who owned it. Meanwhile, by 1984, AC came to an agreement with a Scottish businessman for him to take over AC 3000 ME production and ultimately develop a new improved version. They were confident that they could meet requirements to export to the USA. They took over the tooling and began production in their factory near Glasgow under the business name AC Scotland plc. Sadly, after just over a year, the receivers were called in after producing 30 cars. The proposed new version was going to be powered by an Alfa Romeo V6. I've never driven a 3000 ME, but owners are still very enthusiastic about them. The main negative was that after a period of time the special transmission gave trouble, although the enthusiasts seemed to have resolved that. A big change came about in 1986. Derek Hurlock retired and sold the business, bringing an end to 75 years of the AC company in Thames Ditton. 51% of the business was sold to William West and the other 49% to Autocraft. In 1987, Ford took over that controlling share from West, but not before Ford had cooperated with a design study for a possible new AC. A prototype was built using the mechanicals of the four-wheel drive Ford Sierra. It did not make it into production. Meanwhile, a new factory was constructed at Brooklands and AC Cobra Mark IV production moved there. Another design was drawn up, only to be rejected, but then it did only have a 4-cylinder Ford engine. Then the 3-litre Ford Taurus engine became available, already meeting emissions requirements, etc. Ford consulted Ghia to come up with an improved body style or two, which were also rejected. Anglis, now boss of AC, said Ghia had made some mistakes in some dimensions, which created issues further down the line before the design was abandoned. Autocraft set about creating an impressive prototype car, commissioning IAD to start from scratch. Len Bailey of Ford GT40 fame designed the perimeter-style chassis in stainless steel. As a lifelong amateur student of chassis engineering, I really admired this design. The bodywork was hand-formed aluminium. It's often forgotten that British engineering consultants have had a hand in designing non-British as well as British cars very successfully. IAD were involved with the Mazda MX-5 as well. I saw this new AC under construction when I visited the factory in 1991, and I can tell you that the build quality was even better than my 1949 duralumin panelled AC, a masterpiece in hand-built quality. I often hear car people associate the term hand-built with poor quality, which is an absurd statement since anything can be made good or bad between the two extremes. Take a look at pre-war coach-built cars. This prototype still featured four-wheel drive, which seemed to be all the rage for a short period. Thankfully they dropped this idea for production cars and also changed to the 5-litre Ford V8 as used in the new Cobras. The new AC reused the Ace model name, although retrospectively we usually call them the Brooklands Ace to avoid confusion. This is where things almost turned very bad. Ford weren't happy that the 1991 prototype had been built without their knowledge and decided to petition the courts to liquidate the AC company. While they awaited a court date, Anglis pressed on with his plans. His optimism paid off and he was able to buy out the Ford share, and the new AC Ace was launched in 1993. Jeremy Clarkson tested one on the Top Gear TV show in 1993. Although he liked it, he preferred to save money and could buy a TVR. The following year, racing driver Tiffany Dell also tested an AC on Top Gear and said that Jeremy had missed the point. As a high-quality refined Grand Tourer, the Ace had the right balance between ride and handling. For Car Magazine, LJK Setrai also tested it and was very enthusiastic indeed. This renewed AC business retained the old friendly family feel. As you can see here, I even received Christmas cards from them as the owner of a 1940s AC. The Brooklands Ace was launched at about £55,000, comparable with Jaguars and less than Aston Martins, two brands that Ford had purchased. It looked like a car that cost a lot more to build, and more recent reports suggest that it was indeed sold at a loss. By the mid-1990s, AC collapsed and was bought out again, and Anglis left. I'll end the history there. The AC brand still exists, and new versions of the Cobra and the 1950s style Ace have been launched. Even an electric Ace. I wish them every success. Those who own ACs often keep them for a very long time. There was a 1954 saloon that was owned and run for 57 years by its original owner. ACs have almost always been slightly different from the competition, never a car to blend into the crowd. Attention to detail was a design philosophy, regardless of whether the car seemed either outdated or advanced. My research for this history comes partly from Owners Club articles written first-hand by those directly involved, and also interviews with retired AC employees. That doesn't rule out any mistakes, but I hope this has been accurate and interesting. As a small bonus, I'll end with the sound of two Rudd-speed Aces trying to out-accelerate each other, leaving an event recorded back in 1987. Thanks for listening.